Okay.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our April gathering for the Saskatoon Testing Discussion Group. Like we said earlier on in the year, we wanted to start mixing up our formats a little bit. Last week we had that workshop, which was really well received, so we'll try and plan those into the schedule for next year as well. But today we have more of a presentation and then Q&A as opposed to our regular discussion. Here today from CSS Pension Fund is Kirby McInnes to talk to us about testing in the waterfall environment.
Thanks, Jason. So, yeah, I part of the, what do we call ourselves? The organizational group that puts these together and does planning, and this was one of the items that came up, and I think it was Jason who suggested it as something to do. It's like, we had somebody who knew something about waterfall environments, and everyone who's like 10 plus years younger than me in the group turned and looked at me and said, there'd be somebody who might be old enough to know about waterfall. And so I said, yeah, I'll do it. I don't mind getting up and talking about this kind of stuff. I'm curious about who's familiar with waterfall, say from school, maybe? And who's familiar with waterfall from firsthand, where you actually worked in an environment where you did it? Oh, wow, that's more than I thought there'd be. Geez, now I gotta be careful what I say. So, as I started putting these slides together about this and what it's like to work in waterfall and to try to test in waterfall, which isn't radically different, but it is in some ways. I got working on this. I realized that I haven't really worked in what I would consider full waterfall as per textbooks. My very first project at a university, I think, was pretty close. Worked in a different one where we worked in what we call time boxing, which, you know, is along the lines of iterations, but they were much bigger with a really big team where we had I don't know, a team of 12, and we'd do 3-month time boxes and then a month of testing before releasing. So that was pretty close. So I haven't, not exactly an expert in it, but I have been through it. And I had a while where I spent a lot of time studying methodologies. It was when the group where I was working at, I was in Toronto, that was doing the time boxing thing. We were trying to shift into agile methodologies. So spent a lot of time navel gazing about that. So I went out to the web looking for pictures and things to help describe this for people who might not be familiar with it. I'm assuming if you've got an IT degree, they probably still teach you about this kind of stuff in methodologies, even if you never actually do anything with it. But I like this picture because it's actually a waterfall. It shows the stuff's going downhill because water doesn't flow uphill. And here's where it's from if you want to go look at a place called Incubation. So with a waterfall method, who was here for Ben's presentation when he, a couple of months ago, talked about the hardware kind of stuff that he does, that's very much along these lines in the way it goes. I think you'd agree with me on that, Ben, I think, right? In that they have the idea for what they need to do, chip of some sort. They start analyzing, so they get the requirements, what do they need it to do. They design it, they spec it out. They would do prototypes, I guess, of a few copies so that then they can, so in here they'd get a few copies made so that then they can do the testing. And he showed us, you know, it was a really interesting presentation about the way that they tested and all the weird and wonderful things that they did to their chips in testing. But it's kind of, it's that similar thing. It's largely a one-way trip, except it's not. That's the interesting thing about the waterfall. It's got this perception that, well, it's a one-way trip, but what happens is when you get into this area here, this actually becomes kind of a project unto itself, because you're going to find errors. There's no way you're ever going to develop an error-free product. So when you hit errors, you've got to still go back and do some of these things. So what happens is these phases kind of go around in here as part of testing, which is a fairly large chunk. These kinds of projects tend to, in my experience, in my history, and this was because it was a while ago, tend to be larger projects. I don't know if anyone's ever done Waterfall on a teeny tiny project where the requirements are well known. I haven't, which is ironic because that's probably where it works best. So they tend to be larger projects with large amounts of people, and you get teams, groups going on. You see, when we're dealing with analysis and requirements analysis, anyone done any heavy-duty requirements analysis on things? Writing up lots of use cases or requirements lists, a la rational process, where you write them all out, and functional and non-functional, and give them names and reference numbers so you can trace back to them to try to figure out if that requirement's actually been met. No, lucky you. Anyway, so you get these large teams where you'll have a PM who's trying to herd all the cats. You get business analyst team and a team lead, and they'll have people reporting to them. Your IT team lead, manager, whatever term they use for it, people reporting to them. And a test team lead, same thing. And often in large organizations, they'll report to other line managers for things, and they report to the PM for the term of the project, which throws all kinds of interesting wrenches into how this works, right? Being a PM on some of these can be kind of a challenge. We're not here to talk about project management, we're here to talk about testing. But the team structures can be fairly large and involved, a little bit siloed. They'll all still be part of the same team. In my experience, I've never been on a project where the test team sat in like a completely different building or anything like that. Usually there would be test members as part of the team. So I'll run quickly through all of the different phases, and then we'll get in a little more in depth into the test portion. Because the idea behind it, with it being Waterfall, is that when you're doing your requirements gathering, you're doing all your requirements gathering for the system. So every last bit, at the end of the requirements phase, you've got everything you need to know about what this system is supposed to do. So you've got everything. If it's my background's largely transactional systems, like management systems for, I've done insurance, and current place is pension admin, those kinds of things, administration systems. So they're transactional based. You're adding a person, you're adding a claim for an insurance claim or that kind of thing. So that's my background. So I've been focused on things like inputs and outputs, usually screen oriented, right? Especially, well, like even these days, and still screen oriented. They just happen to be web screens. So you got to figure out everything you need in terms of inputs and outputs for this system. What's required. Also, non-functional. Those kind of standard, right? Your non-functional things, response times, all of that kind of stuff. But the idea behind it is at the end of this, you've got enough information to design the system. So you've got all your requirements, everything you need. Yep, this is what the system is supposed to do. So we'll move into design, right? And you really can have, in a big system, you can have thousands of these things when you get down to, because they're written as a line item piece of text, and it can become quite overwhelming, and that's why there are tools. Rational, anyone worked with the Rational suite of products ever? No? Do they exist anymore? Do they still exist? Okay. Yeah, Rose was the modeling, and there was the requirements gathering portion, and the way to be able to track requirements to implementation pieces, because these projects, it's really easy when you got 1,000 or so of these kinds of things going on. It's really easy to have something fall between the cracks and get missed. So and especially when you did it all in one big fell swoop at the start of a project, and then when you're getting to the point where you're testing, or even when you're developing, it's months later, and the people who were developing weren't necessarily in the room during the requirements gathering portion. Because if you remember, we got these kind of siloed environments. So So it poses some challenges. So once we got the requirements, we can design how the system's going to work, right? So this would be getting into things, once again, my background, database processing, transaction-oriented systems. So your database design, so creating your tables, what they're going to look like. This is where you'd start doing the heavy-duty screen design, and depending on how you're doing requirements analysis, you might have mocked up screens and done that kind of stuff. That varies, but you get into developing your screens here and actually going, this is what it's going to look like, the thing to do this piece of work. Implementation decisions, what kind of technology you're going to use. We're actually, at the place I'm at right now, we are running a Win32 system, because with your implementation decisions, you can do different things, right? If you're running Win32, you use a whole different set of libraries for screen controls and that than you would if you're running web stuff. So the idea is when you're done with this, you're going to have specifications that you could then pass to a developer to be able to build. So you'd have a screen that's going to run. You'd have the database implementation behind it. You say, here's what the screen needs to take for inputs. Here's what it should output. Here's all the edits that should be there. All of that kind of stuff. It's supposed to be complete so that a developer can develop it. That's the idea behind it. Sounds feasible, right? Yeah? Yeah. One catch happens, like in design, if you've picked a certain way to do things and then discover along the way that you need to change that, it can have pretty big impact on a large system. You decided you were going to be Win32 because there was no way we needed a web front end for this. Everything's going to be internal. And then you discover later on that, no, there's two people that we didn't know about out there that actually need web access to get into it or something like that. And so suddenly you're changing whole bunches, because if you designed with the idea that you should have certain screen controls that you could use that don't exist when you are changing your libraries, and it can have some pretty big effects. So we've now gotten to the point where we've got a system designed so that the development team can take over theoretically without having to know anything about having been in the requirements gathering or the design sessions or anything. They do the coding. They do some testing themselves. This would be the first crack at what unit testing, getting through the modules. They would test interactions as well as they're releasing stuff, but any group I've worked on, we've always had testers as part of the team. Often they're the BAs will be involved in testing as well. They'll do dual duty because they were the ones who were there when we were doing the requirements. So you go through this phase, all the development once again. So all your screens, you're developing the entire system at this point. So 30 screens maybe, that kind of thing in a mid-sized sort of system. You're developing them all, you're testing each one, you're doing some interaction testing to get it together so you at least have an idea that things work. Then you're ready for the actual test phase, the integration testing and everything. So what's been happening is, as this has been going along, the test team is building test cases based on the requirements, because they've got to make sure that all the requirements are met, because all those requirements were specified ahead of time, 1,200 of them, say. So they're building large test plans to go through this. It's really, testing itself is actually kind of a mini project unto itself within this overall big project as you get going. So, and contrary to the picture, it's not really just one way. Within testing, you've got to have the testing actually you have to have the ability to go back and fix things, because you're just going to hit errors. So you'll get your team of testers. I've been on teams where the developers become part of the test team. That was the place that did the time boxing. We had 3 months roughly where there'd be, about 8 of us. Then we'd shift into test mode, and so we had a test team lead who would have been building the test cases as we were doing the development, and then they'd start handing out test cases, and you'd test. Make sure you didn't test something you developed, right? That was one of the safeguards, I guess, but we didn't have an entire test team. We had a test manager, and so we'd become testers during that test phase, which is fun. I like testing, so. Anyway, one of the issues that happens is if you're not getting into in-depth testing, and this is where this would be the acceptance test portion as well, where users other than the ones who've been involved in the project might start seeing it. And if you get something where there was a fundamental misunderstanding between the various teams, it can cause a pretty big ripple effect at this point in time. You've worked with, how many people come from an IT background in the room, like on the development side? Okay. So have you worked on development, like even iterative stuff, you're working on a short scale, but you've worked with like a user representative to work on something, and they've given you an idea of how it should work. You get the product into their hand at the end of it, and they go, oh, that's not how I thought it would work. You ever hit that? Yeah, you hit that, right? So in an iterative cycle where it's, say, 2 weeks and short, and you're only dealing with a small amount of stuff, that's okay, right? You can catch that and you go, all right, fundamental misunderstanding, but we've invested a week and a half of effort here. We can change it. At this point, if you're talking 30 screens and that have all been developed and each one takes say 2 weeks of effort or something, because they can be fairly comprehensive, these screens, if you're dealing with, insurance claim processing and that kind of stuff. You're talking a lot more than a week and a half of effort if you get that, oh, that's not how we thought it would work. So it can be non-functional. It's pretty basic stuff about it. It's not radically different. Like when you're testing in this environment, you're still testing. It's just the way it works, because of it's sort of a bizarro world economy of scale, where you're doing this whole big thing and you're going to move this whole big thing down the hose. But because we're dealing with stuff that's complex and got a lot of gray area and undefined, it's not really the best way to go about it. But testing isn't. Who's tested on waterfall projects? Some of you had hands up. Jason, you must have, right? I mean, it's not really the way you test isn't different. You still test. It's just that, hey, geez, it's almost like I paid you to say that. A lot more paperwork. Yes, test plans. Because if you're going to be testing, if your testing is going to be for the entire system instead of a little piece where you've got, 3 or 4 stories that you've written, which are stories, a couple of lines and that kind of thing. And if you're talking about 30 screens and 1,200 requirements, you've got to be able to keep track of it, and you've got to know what you're going to test and maybe what you're not going to test, because it's possible you hit stuff where you had to pull it out because, you're steaming down this waterfall, right? And there's no going back up. And suddenly you've got some stuff where, oh, that's not going to work. Well, we could survive without that for this release. So you got to know what's not going to be tested, because we didn't put that functionality into this screen for this release. So you got to go through all of this. You got a team, so you got to go, what skills do you have to have? Your scheduling. Like I said, it's a mini project. You're running through this. We've got to get through all the testing of these screens. We're going to do it on this date, the milestones for the testing. What kind of environments do you need? You're getting up into, this is full-on integration testing where you're getting ready to release. So you've got 30 screens that all need to work together. They need to work with the database properly with good response. You need to be able to go in and analyze the data as you're running through. If you're going through an entire transaction, say for processing an insurance claim, you got to run it through all its various steps. All of the test case, setup, tear down kind of stuff, because if you run a claim, you can't rerun that claim unless you're going to drop the database data and rebuild it and everything. And that's all stuff you deal with now, right? But you deal with it sometimes on a different scale when it's iterative. Um, so yeah, and this is the big one, right? A lot of there are tools that will work with it. And back in my day when I walked uphill to school both ways 20 miles in winter without shoes on my feet, um, it was all manual. It was all paper-based testing. And you've got to somehow track that back to requirements. And that's why you have these large teams of people. Did you have to track stuff back, Jason? Were you at the...
I used an electronic tool. So back in the requirement solicitation phase, all the requirements were electronically entered, and then as test cases were developed, you had to say what requirement that test case proved.
Yeah.
And then you got a report that told you you need 500 more test cases because these 18 requirements haven't been proven against these 12 environments.
Which is good. We looked at some tools and we went, boy, they're expensive and a lot of work. Like they seem to add to the workload. But I guess when you're dealing with that much stuff, you want to make sure things don't get missed. So test cases would be however you're doing your test cases. They're not. If you're writing use cases, your test case often quite closely mirrors your use case because your use case gives you everything you need for testing with an interaction for the most part. Written use cases, anyone work in use cases, or do you use use cases here now, or do you run stories, or is it mishmash? How are we doing?
Now I'm online. There we go. Vendasa, the concept of use cases around it's just not really called that. We're usually talking more about a persona and a problem that a persona is trying to solve using the software. And so it's the same idea as a use case. It's just different wording to make it a little bit more customer focused.
Okay. So I like use cases. They were one of the things I latched onto when I discovered their existence because they were much better than labeling out just requirements in point form because, oh man, that could make your head spin. So use cases, this is pretty typical for the way the headings in a use case, the sections and how it would work. And they were nice because they laid out, here's the way it should work, here's the things you should catch, and yeah, they were handy, and test cases seemed to work fairly natural with them. Hard to implement, especially if you were going to the place that I was at that had the big time boxes. Then we started moving to iterative development, and we were trying to get into 2-week cycles. And I forget what my role officially was then. I think it was development manager on that team, and we were writing use cases. And we got to the point, it's like, yeah, we can't implement one of these in a 2-week cycle. You just can't. They're too big. So we had to figure out how we broke the use cases down into something else that we could implement, and then track that we actually had finished implementing an entire use case, because that was what kept our requirements. So they were great for gathering the requirements, but then threw a different level of complexity at us in how we had to track things, because you just can't. It has to be a pretty simple use case to be able to do it in a 2-week cycle where you're going to have it all done, everything in 2 weeks. So this is a golden oldie. This one here, the cost of finding an error. And someone came up with this because it fits so nicely as an order of magnitude change every time. So if you can figure out during the analysis stage where you're doing the requirements, writing use cases, whatever you're doing, screen mockups, those are highly recommended. Even one catch you get is if you can mock up things, and if you've still got people, I think maybe in this day and age, most everyone's used to working with computers much more so than 20 years ago when I was doing this kind of stuff, where people who weren't computer people would come to work and have to sit at a computer, and otherwise they might not even have one in the house or anything, whereas now we've got one in our pocket that's infinitely more powerful than the thing I had on my desk then. So but even showing a screen and describing how it would work, and they'd nod, and then you'd implement it and they'd go, oh, And that was just experience. I think that gap has closed quite a lot. But even still, if you could catch something here, this is the idea behind this. You could catch something up there, it would cost $100. So say a couple hours of effort to correct it, fix it at that point in time. If you're in design and you catch it, it might cost you more because you've gotten that much farther along. You're going, oh, we can't use this library because we have to implement this way. And so now we need to change all these designs. But we haven't actually built anything yet, so it's kind of paper-based in that sense. So it might be $1,000. Get into development and you catch something. So in the unit testing, it might be 10,000. But if you get into test and you catch something that's a fundamental error and you have to go back and change 30 screens and it's going to cost you, say 3 days of effort on each screen, right? That's 90 days of effort right there, just to make the changes. Then you've got to retest again because you've changed it all, right? And you have to do that. And so suddenly you're getting up into lots and lots of dollars for an error that gets caught way down here. So, like, if you're looking at this kind of thing, we still do this, right? Because you've got to move toward an end product. So we still go this direction, right? We just shorten the cycle now in what we do. So we don't go, we're going to figure out what the entire system needs and down to the minutest level of detail all at once. We go, here's an idea for a system. Here at this level is what we want it to do. And now we're going to take this chunk of it and start working on it, and all of this we'll just put on the side. And we'll dig our way down into this level with how do we want it to work in more detail. And then we'll develop it, and then we'll get it tested, and then we'll move on to the next chunk. It allows for way more flexibility. And I do have these on that drive. If I'm not sure how are we doing for time? 1:45, is that stop time, roughly? Okay. Well, so we could come back and look at this. This one's no big deal. This is just basically a use case template. But this would be fun to open and look at because it's 28 pages and it's just a template. So, oh. Are you opening it right now? Is that? So that's CDC or disease control, I believe, right, in the U.S. So so all the blue is just telling you what you're supposed to write and everything? $28, I think, is... Oh, 20. Okay, yeah, 20 pages. And that's just the framework for it. So you can see it's... When Jason said it was a lot more paperwork, this is the kind of thing he's talking about. Because you're dealing on this scale, you got to be able to track this stuff, so start writing things down, right? And that's what you end up with. 20 pages and you haven't even started. So I think we've hit this. This was, I found this softwaretestinghelp.com as I was searching around, and they were talking about difference between waterfall and agile and when to use waterfall. And when you look at it, you see it's exactly the opposite of the projects I've been describing, right? Requirements are stable, not changed frequently. I've worked on ones that were large greenfield development projects where their requirements were changing quite a lot. Application was small. No way, they were huge. There is no requirement which is not understood or not very clear. I'm not sure if you'd ever hit that, actually, where there's no requirement that's not understood fully. That would be tough. Stable environment's a little easier. The tools and technology are stable. That's tougher in this day and age, I think. It's things with the wide variety of tools that are out there, it can be a little different, but it's still not insurmountable. It's easy to get in on a short project, especially to deal with tools where the tools aren't constantly changing on you. And then resources are well trained and available. Well, yeah, that helps on pretty much anything you want to do in life, really, not just not just software. But, anyway, that's my trip down memory lane. If anyone's got questions or things you want to talk about.
Excellent.
I have a question. So you said in the last, the final official testing phase, it could go back like one step to development or maybe another step to analysis.
Yep.
Whatever.
Yep.
How far back could it go? Like, did you ever have projects where you had to go really far back up the waterfall because somebody mistake made?
Well, I mean, you could only. It once again depends on what it is. I'm trying to think of. I don't know if we had any that had ripple effects that went far beyond, say, the screen we were working on. I remember. Oh man, that was at an oil company I was working at. That one where we had a couple of really complex screens for processing billing accounts for people. And one of them took, that one screen I think took 3 months. The poor developer, the poor guy who was working on that one, I think it took 3 months to get that one done because they'd get through and they'd hit stuff, get into testing and discover that some things didn't add up quite right. And it was like, oh no, it has to actually balance this way. And oh wait, we can't do it that way. So really what happens is you are hitting, and you get down here, and you have to come back up again because it's like, well, something went off here, and something more than just, oh, I missed an edit, right? It was like, no, it's not balancing over here because we didn't quite describe how this account works properly, and you've got your sales and your billing accounts need to mesh this way, not this way. Whoops. So you start from there, go back and do it again. And I don't recall ever hitting any where it was so fundamental that we questioned whether we should just scrap the whole project or anything. Because you can get that. I mean, you want to read about software disasters, large software projects. I mean, they're just ripe for that. And it's why Agile exists these days, right? Is to try to reduce that missing the mark.
Yeah, there certainly are some good examples out there of where the analysis was flawed, and thus everything downstream was wrong. They built a beautiful project that couldn't do any of its requirements because the first analysis stage was wrong. Those are getting fewer and further between as the science of requirements analysis and elicitation has gotten better over the past 40 years.
And it is shortening that, right? So if that's obvious, the simplest way is to reduce the scope of what it is you're going to implement and get down to this point as you go. And even rational unified process was probably one of the first ones to take this on. It was sort of pseudo waterfall where they started rolling waves. And so they would run through this with the understanding that, so the first thing you're going to push out won't be necessarily ready for release, right? Agile, if you're getting into the hardcore Agile stuff, everything you do is production, so that if your project stops tomorrow, you've at least given the client something that they might be able to use in production. Rational Unified Process was a little less so. It would said, well, we know you're building these large things, and the very first couple of releases may not actually be production, but you need to shorten the amount of this that you do so you can get it into the hands of users. Because that was the fundamental shift, and that was the thing that really helped start changing things about software, was get it into the hands of users faster, get the stuff out there before you've built it all, because you're going to miss stuff. It just happens, and shortening that cycle makes a big difference.
When building these test cases, is there a focus on the risk associated with the case? I know in working with conformance things before, they'd start from step 1 and work through till step 400, and if something fails, they'd stop there and wait for you to fix it and then start at step 1 again. as opposed to identifying where the actual risk is with a particular fix, or so you can resume or only target the things that are actually potentially
Wow.
affected by it.
They'd actually stop. Just it
You'd
failed.
stop. You're allowed one major failure to meet conformance. If you had 2 in your set, that
Yeah.
was stop. We'll start at step 1 again. I'll tell you if that works in 7 hours from now when I get back there.
That's sounds like bureaucracy run amok to me.
That's
Any place
sketch
I've
one.
worked at, you tested. You did as much testing as you could through a test case to get it done and get as many of the errors out as you can. Because if you're going to send it back to a developer, give them as much as possible to work on, and then come back and run through the thing again. Because if you stop, like if there's 200 steps and you stop at step 38, you've got to start at you've got to start at step 1 again to go through, right? You can't start at step 37. You got to go back and start again. So you might as well get through as much as you can. So no, I never worked at a place that did that. It was find as much wrong as you can with this thing, send it back then to development to fix all of those things, and then test again.
In Dale's defense, you're talking mostly about conformance testing,
Yeah.
where the outcome isn't actual testing; it's proof of conformance. So
Yeah.
you have to
Oh, okay.
you have to have an auditable trail of 200 test cases that pass in a row that prove the entire audit.
Oh, I see.
He worked in e-records for health, so
Oh man, ouch. Okay, I haven't worked at anything that's had that stringent of a requirement. Where I am now, I guess, but the requirement there is just keep everything for the most part, right?
one more over there.
So the feeling I get out of this presentation is that Waterfall doesn't have a lot of pros and has mostly cons. Do you know why companies would still continue to use this now? Or are there a lot of companies that are using it?
There's a surprising number of companies
Yeah.
that still do it. It fits very nicely into a hierarchical management model. And so it's very easy to budget. It's very easy to buy resources from. It's very easy to manage the HR side of. And, well, to outsource portions of it, true. But it's very easy to convince yourself that you know everything, and thus it makes
Yeah.
sense.
I wouldn't say it's very easy to manage it. I think that there's the illusion that it's easier because you've done all this work at the start. You've sat down, you've tried to estimate how long it's going to take to build all these 30 screens. And so when it comes to budgeting, you've got a better number to work with than Agile, where they go, oh, I'll tell you later. Or they go, or how much money do you have to spend, right? Because a budgetary manager never wants to hear that because they go, you're just going to spend all my money then. And not necessarily true, but because what happens is here. Craig Larman had a great quote about project management, which especially in this kind of environment, but where project management's like asking a guy jumping off a building halfway down how it's going, right? So far, so good. So because you still can't control things in this environment, but it gives the illusion that you can. And then, then you get into change management and all that kind of stuff, and it can become, if small projects, I would say, like those last points, if you had a small project where it was stable and you're doing stuff, sure, because maybe you go, well, we don't want to just bloody-mindedly stick to the 2-week iterations when we look at this and this is not that big, and if we just broke it down and went through the whole thing and in 8 weeks we'd be done. But we want to, the way it falls out, we don't want to have to try to break up stuff to get them into an iteration and a release. We'll just do it all in a larger one. Something like that, I'd say, then maybe that would work well.
You'll also find that this gets used a lot in your AAA entertainment releases, like your games by EA or large software platforms, your Microsoft Words, etc. They're done more along this pattern because they know what features they want to add, or the cost of the resources I'm thinking now in terms of a AAA title where you have to do motion capture and then modeling and then skinning, all of those pieces. It's really hard to make a thin vertical slice of a first-person shooter that has motion capture of actual Marines. You're going to spend 6 months doing motion capture of the Marines and then 6 months modeling. And so the idea of being able to compartmentalize everything, give it timelines, budgets, the dreaded Gantt chart. I didn't see that one up there. The dreaded Gantt chart, which says I have to start this on this day in order for it to be done by this day because this other piece needs it. It's all very, very illusionarily promising from a management point of view.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm thinking like, you mentioned, right, it should be like Waterfall is used in small applications, but I see mostly opposite, like mostly company using Waterfall model where the projects are big. Like, suppose if it's a small, like 1 month, 2 months, they just go iterative or whatever, like agile. But it's used like opposite, like mostly if the projects are big, the company prefer, or like the companies are using Waterfall model. And so how, first of all, is it like a true, or is it like just people are not very, doesn't follow the ideal situation, like if the project is small then they should use Waterfall? And another thing is like how do you judge based on time frame, like where we should use Waterfall, like how big is the project, how do you decide that? Like do you have some insight on that?
I wouldn't go to a waterfall environment unless I was forced to, for the type of development that I do, like that any teams that I manage, because I'm a manager now, so I don't really know anything anymore. But for the teams that I manage and that kind of stuff, I I would lean toward agile, some kind of agile type methodology.
You said you're right, like the Waterfall model is used where the application is small, but I have seen mostly other way.
Yes.
Like companies using it when the projects are
And that comes back to when Emily was asking that question about the idea that they've got better control, because you're doing all this planning up front. So obviously we must know what we're doing because we put all this effort into planning and estimating, and so we've got an idea of the budget, and it's.
So it's like some of the cons maybe are like company prefer some of the pros as compared to cons of the Waterfall model. That's why they go for it. You got an answer for that one? I'm not sure.
I don't, unfortunately. But I stepped up to the front to say thank you very much for attending our gathering for this month. There are 2 sessions left in the current season. We of course will have a May and a June. The organization team has put topics on them tentatively. We need to do a little bit of work to get them ready, so watch for announcements of the next 2. The one in June, watch out for, because it might not happen on the day that you want it to. We're looking at getting a remote guest speaker in, and we got to match his schedule. So June's date might wiggle a little bit, so keep an eye on that one. Other than that, keep an eye on your inbox. There'll be a poll going out soon. We're looking for feedback for you guys on what to do with our next season. More discussion groups, more workshops, more presentations, topics, etc. We want feedback from you guys, because otherwise it'll be the things that Kirby and Ben and Dale and I are interested in. I know that we're interesting guys, so stuff we're interested in is awesome, but we want stuff that is interesting to everybody. Thank you very much for coming out.